The American Society of Civil Engineers just gave the United States energy infrastructure a D+. Not a B, not a C, a D+. The same grade you got in high school that meant you barely passed. And this is not some fringe organization making that call. The ASCE is the oldest engineering society in the country, founded in 1852, and their infrastructure report card is the most widely cited assessment of American infrastructure published anywhere in the world. Their 2025 report warned of a staggering investment gap that could exceed $700 billion by 2033 just to modernize the electrical grid to a level that would be considered adequate. Not excellent, not world-class, adequate. And at the same time, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, the official federally designated watchdog for grid reliability, published its 2025 long-term reliability assessment and found that summer peak electricity demand is forecast to grow by 224 gigawatts over the next decade, a 69% increase from what they projected just 1 year earlier. That is not a gradual revision. That is a forecast that nearly doubled in 12 months. NERC's Director of Reliability Assessments, John Morris, said it plainly, and the compound annual growth rates for both summer and winter peak demand are the highest since NERC began tracking in 1995. 30 years of data, and the growth rate right now is the fastest that has ever been recorded. And the system that is supposed to absorb that growth is graded D+ by the engineers who build these systems for a living, and nobody is ready for what happens when it fails. Not the federal government, not the state governments, not the utility companies, and certainly not the 330 million Americans whose water, food, medicine, heat, communication, transportation, and financial system all stop functioning the moment the electricity stops flowing. Artificial intelligence is devouring the grid faster than anything in the history of electricity consumption. The phrase, quote, "one makes people think that the internet and artificial intelligence exist somewhere weightless and ethereal, floating above the physical world. They do not. AI lives inside enormous data centers packed with servers that run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and each one of those servers consumes electricity at a rate that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. A single ChatGPT query uses approximately 10 times the electricity of a standard Google search. A single AI training run for a large language model can consume as much electricity as 100 American homes use in an entire year, and the number of data centers being built in the United States right now is exploding. PJM Interconnection, the regional grid operator that serves 65 million people across 13 states and the District of Columbia, expects over 25,000 megawatts of new demand by 2034, driven primarily by data centers. More than half of that demand is expected to arrive by 2029, which is only 3 years from now. 25,000 megawatts is roughly equivalent to the entire electricity consumption of a country like Ireland, and it is being added to a single grid region in a single decade. NERC's 2025 assessment noted that data centers, cryptocurrency mining, hydrogen fuel plants, and other large industrial loads are driving the demand surge that is overwhelming the grid's capacity to keep up. The assessment found that over the past year, fossil fuel generation capacity dropped by 21 gigawatts, while battery, wind, and solar capacity increased by 23 gigawatts. The numbers look roughly balanced until you understand the difference between dispatchable power and intermittent power. A natural gas plant generates electricity whenever the grid operator tells it to. A solar panel generates electricity when the sun is shining. A wind turbine generates electricity when the wind is blowing, and a battery stores electricity for a few hours but cannot sustain output for the multi-day periods that extreme weather events require. The coal and gas plants that are being retired provided electricity on demand, around the clock, regardless of weather. The renewables and batteries that are replacing them provide electricity conditionally, intermittently, and for limited durations. And the grid is being asked to absorb the largest demand increase in its history while simultaneously replacing its most reliable generation sources with its least reliable ones. NERC warned that the share of variable energy resources on the grid during peak hours grew from 9.5% to 10.2% in a single year, and that many inverter-based resources do not inherently provide essential reliability services like synchronous inertia, which is the physical property that keeps the grid's frequency stable and prevents cascading failures. When the grid loses too much inertia, frequency fluctuations become dangerous. Equipment trips offline to protect itself, and the cascading failures that follow are how a local problem becomes a regional blackout. And the irony of the AI demand surge is that the same companies building these data centers are marketing artificial intelligence as the solution to grid management, load forecasting, and energy optimization. They are simultaneously creating the problem and selling the cure. Meta, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon are collectively planning to spend over $200 billion on AI infrastructure in the next 3 years. Each of those data centers requires a dedicated power supply equivalent to a small city. In Northern Virginia, which hosts the largest concentration of data centers in the world, the local utility Dominion Energy has warned that it cannot build transmission lines fast enough to serve the facilities that have already been permitted. Interconnection queues, the waiting lists that new generators and large loads must join before connecting to the grid, have ballooned to over 2,600 gigawatts nationally. That is more than twice the total installed generation capacity of the entire United States. Most of those projects will never be built, but the demand they represent is real, and the grid is being asked to serve it with infrastructure that was designed in the 1960s and 1970s for a fundamentally different pattern of electricity consumption. The grid was built for a world where demand was predictable, seasonal, and grew at 1 to 2% per year. It is now facing demand growth of 4 to 5% per year in some regions, concentrated in specific geographic areas where data centers cluster near fiber optic backbone connections, and arriving on a timeline that is measured in months rather than the years that grid infrastructure requires to plan, permit, and build. More than half the country faces an elevated risk of blackouts, and NERC set it in writing. NERC's reliability map is the single most alarming document published by any federal authority in 2025, and virtually no mainstream news outlet covered it in the depth it deserved. The map shows the continental United States divided into grid regions, each color-coded by risk level. More than half the continent faces an elevated or high risk of energy shortfalls within the next 5 years. The Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, which covers 15 states from Manitoba to Louisiana, faces a high risk beginning in the 2028 to 2031 timeframe. PJM Interconnection, which serves the eastern seaboard from New Jersey to Virginia and west to Illinois, faces elevated risks beginning in 2026. That is this year. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, which operates the isolated Texas grid that came within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of total collapse during Winter Storm Uri in 2021, faces surging load growth that is driving resource adequacy concerns as the share of dispatchable resources struggles to keep pace. The Southwest Power Pool and the New England region face elevated risks beginning in 2025 and 2026 respectively, with energy shortfalls possible under extreme conditions, and NERC explicitly warned that winter seasons are replacing summer as the higher risk periods due to generator performance and fuel supply issues. The natural gas system that American electricity generation increasingly depends on is itself vulnerable to the same extreme weather that causes demand to spike. During Winter Storm Uri, natural gas wellheads froze, pipelines lost pressure, and compressor stations that move gas through the system lost their own electricity supply, creating a cascading feedback loop where the failure of the electrical grid caused the failure of the gas system that was supposed to fuel the electrical grid. Limited pipeline capacity, competition with residential heating demand, and production disruptions can all cause fuel shortages for the generators that are supposed to keep the lights on during the exact moments when keeping the lights on matters most. And 60,000 megawatts of coal generation capacity have been announced for retirement over the next 5 years. Coal plants, whatever their environmental drawbacks, had one reliability advantage that no other fuel source matches. They kept months of fuel on site. A coal pile does not freeze in a pipeline. It does not require a compressor station. It does not compete with residential heating demand. When the grid needed power, the coal plant burned the pile that was sitting right next to it. And those plants are being closed at a pace that NERC's own assessment says is outrunning the replacement infrastructure. Utilities have already reversed or delayed 16,000 megawatts of coal retirements since 2022 because the replacement capacity is not arriving fast enough to justify shutting down the plants that currently exist. 1,700 attacks on the grid were recorded in a single year, and the transformers that were destroyed take 2 years to replace. In 2022, the Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center recorded approximately 1,700 reports of attacks, vandalism, or suspicious activities targeting electrical infrastructure in the United States. That included at least 25 actual physical attacks, more than 4 times the 6 recorded in 2021. In December 2022, a coordinated substation shooting in Moore County, North Carolina, knocked out power to 45,000 customers for days. Near Tacoma, Washington, another substation attack left tens of thousands without electricity. And the most sophisticated grid attack in U.S. history occurred in April 2013 at the Metcalfe Transmission Substation in California, where attackers first severed fiber optic communication cables to disable surveillance, then used high-powered rifles to fire over 100 rounds into cooling radiators of 17 large power transformers. The attack caused over $15 million in damage and took 27 days to repair. The sitting FERC chairman at the time called it the most significant incident of domestic terrorism involving the grid that had ever occurred. And here is the fact that should terrify every American who depends on electricity, which is every American. Large power transformers, the kind that were attacked at Metcalfe, are custom-built pieces of equipment that weigh between 100 and 400 tons, cost between $3 million and $10 million each, and take between 12 and 24 months to manufacture. There is no domestic manufacturing base that can produce them at the volume needed to replace multiple damaged units simultaneously. Approximately 80% of large power transformers used in the United States are imported. The supply chain runs through South Korea, Germany, Mexico, and China. If a coordinated attack destroyed a dozen large transformers across multiple substations in different states, the replacement timeline would be measured in years, not weeks. And during those years, the regions served by those transformers would operate at reduced capacity with rolling blackouts as the standard operating condition. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, responded to the Metcalfe attack by ordering NERC to develop a mandatory physical security standard called CIP-014. Critics have contended that the standard remains weak with minimal enforcement. Most substations in America are protected by chain-link fencing and padlocked gates. Some have cameras. Few have armed security. And the vulnerability has been public knowledge for over a decade without a corresponding investment in physical protection. And there is a compounding factor that almost nobody discusses. The workforce of skilled line workers, substation technicians, and power plant operators is aging and shrinking. The average age of a utility line worker in America is over 50. The pipeline of new workers is not keeping pace with retirements. When a major grid event requires thousands of skilled workers to deploy simultaneously across multiple states, the mutual assistance agreements that utilities rely on may not produce enough bodies because there are not enough skilled workers in the entire industry to go around. Every additional day without power in a multi-state blackout compounds the humanitarian crisis, because water, food, medicine, communication, and fuel systems do not pause while the workforce catches up. U.S. intelligence agencies consistently warn that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea possess the capability and potential intent to launch disruptive cyber attacks against American critical infrastructure, including the electrical grid. The digital attack surface has expanded as utilities adopt smart grid technology, internet-connected sensors, and automated control systems that improve efficiency but simultaneously create new entry points for adversaries. A major cyber attack could disable grid control systems across multiple regions simultaneously, and unlike a physical attack that damages a specific piece of equipment, a cyber intrusion could corrupt the software that controls equipment everywhere, making restoration dependent on clearing the malware before any hardware can be restarted. The Iran war just proved that everything connected to energy can break at once, and America's grid is connected to all of it. The International Energy Agency described the Strait of Hormuz crisis as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Oil went from $70 to $120 per barrel. Natural gas prices surged in sympathy. The March 2026 CPI showed energy prices rising 10.9% in a single month, the largest increase in the energy index since September 2005. And every one of those energy price increases flows directly into the cost of operating the American electrical grid because natural gas generates approximately 43% of U.S. electricity. When the price of natural gas rises because of a Middle Eastern war that closed the Strait of Hormuz, the cost of generating electricity at every natural gas power plant in America rises in lockstep, and that cost is passed to consumers through their utility bills. The Urban Institute documented that residential electricity costs have increased faster than earnings across much of the country. leaving customers paying about $40 more per month in December 2025 than they paid in December 2017. And that data was collected before the Iran war sent natural gas prices higher still. Bloomberg reported that natural gas prices in the past year have risen more than twice as much as wages. Electricity bills have run well ahead of overall inflation, especially as power-hungry data centers come online and compete for the same generation capacity that residential customers need. The grid is being simultaneously attacked by rising demand from AI data centers, rising fuel costs from the Middle East war, rising physical attacks on infrastructure, rising cyber threats from nation-states, rising retirements of reliable baseload generation, and rising extreme weather events that test the system's capacity at the exact moments when failure is most dangerous. Each of those pressures alone would be manageable. Their simultaneous convergence on a system that was graded D+ by the engineers who understand it best is what creates the conditions for the kind of failure that most Americans cannot imagine until it happens to them. And when it happens, the cascade is immediate and total. A prolonged power outage triggers the collapse of communication networks. Cell towers have 4 to 8 hours of battery backup. After that, your phone is a brick. Water purification plants shut down because they require electricity to pump and treat water. Within 24 to 48 hours, water pressure drops to zero in urban systems. Financial transactions freeze because every ATM, every credit card terminal, every bank server, every stock exchange depends on electricity. Medical equipment in hospitals runs on generator backup, but generators require diesel, and diesel requires delivery by trucks, and trucks require fuel from gas stations. And gas stations require electricity to pump fuel from underground tanks. The cascade touches everything because everything is connected to electricity, and the system that provides it is the most stressed, most underfunded, most overloaded, most threatened that it has been in the modern history of the American electrical grid. And there is a dimension to the grid vulnerability that connects directly to the Iran war and the Strait of Hormuz crisis in a way that most Americans have not considered. The United States has been positioning natural gas as the bridge fuel that replaces retiring coal plants while renewable energy scales up. That bridge depends on the assumption that natural gas will be affordable and available. The Iran war shattered that assumption. Natural gas prices are globally linked through the LNG export market, and when the Strait of Hormuz closed, LNG shipments from Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, were disrupted. European countries that were already paying premium prices for LNG after the Russian gas cutoff in 2022 began competing even more aggressively for available supply. That competition bid up global LNG prices, which in turn raised domestic natural gas prices in the United States because American producers can now choose between selling gas domestically at the domestic price or liquefying it and exporting it at the higher global price. Every molecule of natural gas exported as LNG is a molecule not available to generate electricity at an American power plant. And the Iran war has created a sustained global LNG price premium that will persist for months or years regardless of whether the strait reopens, because the structural vulnerability it exposed will be priced into every LNG contract written from this point forward. The bridge fuel that was supposed to make the energy transition smooth and reliable is now subject to the same geopolitical volatility that oil has always carried. And the American grid's 43% dependence on natural gas for electricity generation means that 43% of America's electricity supply is now directly connected to the stability of the Middle East, the shipping lanes of the Gulf, and the foreign policy decisions of the president. When the grid was powered by coal stored on site and nuclear plants fueled by domestically enriched uranium, the electricity system was functionally immune to Middle Eastern geopolitics. It is no longer immune. It is connected. And the connection runs through the exact choke point that has been closed for the past 7 weeks. What a multi-day blackout actually looks like in a country that has forgotten how to live without electricity. Americans who lived through the 2003 Northeast blackout, which lasted approximately 2 days and affected 55 million people across the northeastern United States and Ontario, remember the experience as an inconvenience, a story to tell, an adventure. But the 2003 blackout lasted 48 hours in most areas. The grid conditions that NERC is warning about, the conditions created by the convergence of demand growth, generation retirement, fuel supply vulnerability, physical attacks, and cyber threats, could produce a blackout lasting weeks, not days. And a multi-week blackout in a country that has systematically eliminated every alternative to grid-dependent electricity is not an inconvenience. It is a civilization-level event. Consider what happens in sequence. In the first hour, traffic signals go dark. Every intersection in the affected area becomes a four-way stop navigated by drivers who have never driven without signals. Accidents multiply. Emergency services are overwhelmed before they have fully assessed the scope of the outage. In the first 6 hours, refrigerated food begins to spoil. The 72 hours of food that the average American grocery store keeps on its shelves begins its countdown clock because the cold chain that keeps perishable food safe requires continuous refrigeration that no longer exists. In the first 24 hours, gas stations cannot pump fuel because the pumps are electric. Hospitals running on generator backup begin rationing fuel because diesel delivery trucks are unable to refuel. Pharmacies cannot process prescriptions because their computer systems are down. Insulin, which requires refrigeration, begins to degrade in the homes of 8.4 million American diabetics. In the first 48 hours, cell towers exhaust their battery backup and go dark. Americans lose the ability to call 911, contact family members, access news, or receive emergency instructions. Water pressure drops in urban systems that depend on electric pumps to move water from treatment facilities to homes. Toilets stop flushing, taps run dry, and the social fabric that depends on the assumption that help is a phone call away begins to fray. In rural America, where the nearest hospital may be 45 minutes away and where well water depends on electric pumps, the consequences arrive even faster. Approximately 43 million Americans get their water from private wells with electric pumps. When the power goes out, their water stops instantly. No flushing, no drinking, no watering livestock. Home medical equipment that keeps Americans alive. CPAP machines used by 8 million. Home oxygen concentrators used by 1.5 million. Powered wheelchairs, home dialysis machines, insulin pumps, all require continuous electricity. Medicare does not provide backup power. Medicaid does not cover generators. The Americans who depend on these devices are disproportionately elderly, disabled, low-income, and rural. The population's least likely to have backup power and most likely to be forgotten when the grid goes down. In the first week, the economic damage enters the hundreds of billions. The Texas winter storm of 2021, which lasted approximately 5 days and affected a single state, caused economic damages estimated as high as $295 billion and killed at least 246 people. A multi-state blackout lasting 1 to 2 weeks would make the Texas event look like a local inconvenience, and the recovery timeline depends entirely on whether the cause of the blackout can be addressed. A transformer failure can be repaired in weeks if spare parts exist, which they often do not because of the import dependency and the 12 to 24-month manufacturing lead time. A cyber attack that corrupts grid control software can require a complete system rebuild before any equipment can be safely re-energized. And a cascading failure triggered by extreme weather on a grid that lacks adequate reserve capacity may require a __quote_2__ procedure, which is the process of restarting the grid from zero with no outside power source, using only the small generators at specific designated black start facilities. A black start of a major interconnection has never been attempted in the United States under real-world conditions. It has been simulated, it has been planned for, but it has never been executed at scale. And the simulations assume that the physical infrastructure is intact, that communication systems are functional, that trained personnel are available, and that the weather cooperates. In a real multi-week blackout caused by the convergence of multiple failure modes, none of those assumptions may hold. An NERC specifically noted in January 2026 that during Winter Storm Fern, the DOE had to issue 8 emergency orders under Section 202C of the Federal Power Act authorizing grid operators across ERCOT, PJM, ISO New England, NYISO, and Duke Energy to run generating units at maximum output regardless of environmental regulations and to activate backup generation at data centers as a last resort measure before declaring energy emergency conditions. The fact that data center backup generators were authorized as a last resort to prevent blackouts during a single winter storm in January 2026 tells you exactly how thin the margins already are. The grid did not fail during Fern, but it did not survive on its own engineering capacity. It survived on emergency executive orders that suspended environmental law, drafted private backup generators into public service, and authorized every available generating unit to run at levels that are normally prohibited because they produce excessive pollution. That is not a grid operating within its design parameters. That is a grid held together by the administrative equivalent of duct tape and prayer. And the next storm, the next heat wave, the next demand spike from data centers being brought online simultaneously in Virginia and Texas and Georgia will test that duct tape again, and eventually the duct tape will not hold. Few states have conducted exercises at scale to test what a full grid restart would actually look like when combined with the simultaneous collapse of water systems, communication networks, fuel distribution, food supply, and medical services. The Federation of American Scientists published an analysis warning that there are no transparent protocols or criteria for safeguarding critical medical services during rolling blackouts and no frameworks to prioritize regions for power restoration that ensure equitable treatment for low-income and socially vulnerable communities. FEMA coordinates interagency response through its National Response Framework, but the framework was designed for natural disasters that affect specific geographic areas, not for a systemic grid failure that affects entire interconnections spanning dozens of states simultaneously. The Department of Energy issued 8 emergency orders during Winter Storm Fern in January 2026, authorizing grid operators in ERCOT, PJM, ISO New England, NYISO, and Duke Energy to run generating units at maximum output regardless of air quality limits and to activate backup generation at data centers as a last resort measure before declaring energy emergency conditions. That the DOE had to authorize data center backup generators as a last resort to prevent blackouts in January 2026 tells you exactly how thin the margins already are. The system is being held together by emergency orders and temporary exemptions from environmental regulations. That is not resilience. That is improvisation, and improvisation has a failure rate that increases with every additional stress placed on the system. The next winter storm. Ura. The next summer heat wave that breaks records across the Sun Belt. The next cyber attack that takes down a regional control center, the next physical attack that destroys a critical substation during a period of peak demand will test a system that is graded D+, that is losing its most reliable generators to retirement, that is absorbing the largest demand increase in 30 years from data centers that did not exist a decade ago, and that is facing fuel cost increases driven by a Middle East war that has disrupted 20% of the world's oil supply. Share this video with every American you know who uses electricity, which is every American you know. Because the information in this video is the difference between a household that has a plan and a household that discovers it does not have a plan when the lights go out and the water stops and the phone goes dark and the grocery store closes and the gas station cannot pump and the hospital is rationing diesel and nobody is coming because nobody can get through. That is not a dystopian fantasy. That is the scenario that the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the American Society of Civil Engineers, the Federation of American Scientists, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, and the International Energy Agency have all independently identified as increasingly probable within the next decade. Subscribe and turn on notifications because I will be covering every grid emergency, every NERC assessment, every extreme weather event, and every infrastructure failure that moves this timeline closer to reality. Take care of yourselves out there. The grid was not built for what is coming, and the people who prepared before it arrived will be the people who survived it. Not because they were smarter, not because they were wealthier, because they paid attention when the warnings were loud enough to hear and acted while the window to act was still open. That window is open right now. It will not be open forever. And when it closes without warning, without announcement, and without a second chance.